Connections between art and science are nothing new. Think of Da Vinci. He said, to develop a complete mind, study the science of art, study the art of science, learn to see, realize that everything is connected to everything else. Though nothing new, connections today are not generally made. And why is that? Well, today, specialization drives knowledge, and specialists are not predisposed to seeing connections. Also, of the two disciplines, science alone is thought to be objective and rational and rigorous, where art is thought to be, or perceived to be, quite the opposite. Not objective, but personal. Not rational, but intuitive and expressive. Not rigorous, but moody and delicate. Not a rule-bound discipline, but an unbound anything goes and subjective free-for-all. Of course, the operative words here are perceived to be that art is not as rigorous as science, that it doesn't have great explanatory power and world-changing effect. Well, that's a myth. Because actually, creative practice engages concepts, research, methods, strategies, workflows, as much as, and as rigorous as, any discipline in which these things are taken for granted. Given this, it seems perfectly reasonable for an artist and a scientist to put their heads together, to collaborate, and draw connections across their disciplinary divides. There seems ample reason for hospitality. I'm an artist, also a philosopher and educator. I put my head together with a scientist recently, and I'll tell you that story. It begins with a greenhouse and with algae. Greenhouses are interesting. As the built environments harnessing the forces of vegetal nature that we know them to be, they date back some 500 to 600 years. Their history is appreciably complex and even problematic, and that's interesting. And there's another interesting history to greenhouses, one that dates back some 3 billion years. How's that, you ask? There were no built environments that long ago. Correct. But here, we're talking about connections, not logic. I mentioned algae. Fossil records would have it that algae are some 3 billion years old. Algae have played a remarkable role in the production and life of plants, and therefore, in the life of breathing creatures like us. Algae are a force of nature. They're the sort of thing a scientist would study. And if you bear with me, they're also a force of art, the sort of thing an artist would study. Algae. What do algae have to do with greenhouses? Well, let me take you back to 2021. Not exactly the deep time of algae, but let's start there and work our way back. 2 weeks prior to my official start as the program director of creative arts at Bellevue University, I made a visit to campus. I saw a greenhouse. It made an impression. And you know how it is when you see something and something similar comes to mind, something you've seen before. Well, in this case, coming immediately to my mind was another greenhouse, the Garfield Park Conservatory in Chicago. What made the conservatory greenhouse memorable was that 2 data-driven artists had activated it as an immersive environment of light and shadow, reflection and color, especially of color. And algae has a color, and we're going to be getting to that. So there was this campus greenhouse and this conservatory greenhouse, and everything was clear. Go beyond the job description of the job that I had yet to begin. Find out who it is confronting the forces of vegetal nature in this campus greenhouse. Call the Chicago-based data-driven artists and connect them. I knocked on the door of Dr. John Kint, a microbiologist at Bellevue. I introduced myself and got almost immediately to the point. Would you like to do something, I asked. Collaborate. Without hesitation, without knowing me, without knowing anything of the nature of the collaboration, nor anything of my competency to carry one out, he said yes. Now, mind you, I introduced myself as an artist and philosopher. That a scientist was not put off by this goes to show just how hospitable this particular scientist is. As for Sean and Petra, I called them and asked them the same question that I asked my new hospitable scientist friend. There's a greenhouse here. The science guy who runs it grows and researches algae. Would you like to do something about this? Collaborate. Well, they, like John, without hesitation, said yes. Now, I hadn't thought any of this through. It just came of a sudden, a kind of double take and twofold tale. I saw a greenhouse, I saw another greenhouse, and made a connection. The conservatory greenhouse was activated by art. If I were to have my way, the campus greenhouse would be activated by art. Things were seen, connections were made, doors were knocked on, questions were asked, answers were given, and action was taken. This was to set into motion a whole host of deliberations and discoveries and unforeseen output. And so now you're likely wondering, what is it that the artists and the scientists did? And you'll notice I left myself out of your question. I'll get back to that as well. Well, one thing they did is paper chromatography. Paper chromatography is a chemical technique of separating mixtures into their components using a certain type of paper. In this case, the mixtures were pigments extracted from algae and plants native to Nebraska. You spot a sample of the pigment on a strip of paper, place it in a fluid solvent. The solvent, through capillary action, travels up the paper, separating the pigment into its component colors that are otherwise hidden from us. Now, as a scientist, you study this color dissection, and you write a paper. As an artist, your mind is basically blown. Because instead of blending colors for aesthetic effect, you now have color separation as a basis for creative production. Now, you essentially have paintings that paint themselves, indistinguishably forces of nature and forces of art. This was all very exciting for the artists and the scientists, that is. It was not the same for me. You see, from the outset, I was the matchmaker, a conjurer of collaborations and cross-disciplinary connections, not the artist-philosopher that I am and was hired to be. As interesting as being a conjurer may seem, there is an occupational hazard to being one that I, for one, did not foresee. An artist, not practicing art, but connecting artists with a non-artist, a scientist. Winning an Innovation and Teaching Award for doing so was flattering and validating, and I am ever appreciative, but it did nothing for the identity crisis. And yet, there came to be a reversal. And I'll tell it to you in another story. Do you remember when I said we would work our way back to deep time from 2021? Well, here we go. There's a lake in northwestern Iran, a salt lake called Lake Urmia. It changes color from a gorgeous green under certain conditions to a deep wine red under other conditions. What accounts for this is algae, a certain strain of algae, Dunaliella salina. In spring, snowmelt from the Savalan and Sahan massives carried by the Talke River infuse the lake with fresh water. The lake grows, salinity drops. In years when precipitation is low and runoff insufficient, the lake shrinks and salinity rises. In conditions of low salinity, we get our gorgeous green. In conditions of high salinity, we get deep wine red. This lake is some 30,000 years old. The massives are as old as 12 million years. In deep time, nature is a painter. I was drawn to this lake, this particular lake, Lake Urmia. My father was born in Urmia in 1912. And wouldn't you know, John had previously worked with the same algae that is found in this lake. So this was it. This was the moment. This was the moment to leap from connector and conjurer to creative, from facilitator and observer to participant. We ordered some of the same algae that is found in the lake of my ancestral home. We're scaling it up, and this takes time. And so we'll see what comes of it for me as an artist. But something will come of it. Of this, I am certain, because now the forces of ancestry and autobiography are at my back. And you can imagine this collaboration with my past, this inheritance that I could not possibly have anticipated, could quite possibly be very deeply satisfying. At first, it may seem disobedient and impertinent to cross disciplinary divides, but it's actually an opportunity. Sure, do your job, but also go beyond it. Knock on doors, meddle in the affairs of others whose competencies are not your competencies. Sure, finish what you start, but along the way, change what you start and finish that. Whatever connections mean to you, making them a practice and trust the process of doing so. Find in your world the double takes and twofold tails. Be attentive, be affirmative, say yes. Look for affinities and similarities. They're everywhere. And with these in hand, be creative and be deliberate about it. Before you know it, you are leaping beyond your intentions, well-intentioned, as they surely are, to something you could not have anticipated, to something that could be quite possibly very deeply satisfying. And so what is creativity? Creativity is leaping beyond well-intended intentions to something that cannot be anticipated. And what are connections? Those are a means to creativity. Thank you.